I feel like I'd be remiss if we didn't mention essentially one of the downsides to the PS5 Pro, and that is patches that aren't good that you can't disable. Because this is a problem, and we saw this on PS4 Pro as well. The idea is a developer patches and support specifically for the Pro, but the decisions that they make produce results that I think we could say aren't great. And that's definitely the case here. So the first one is actually one that I would say has just left the failure zone. That's Metal Gear Solid Delta. And Tom and I talked about this recently on the last Direct. That would have been absolutely in the failure category because at launch it was unstable frame rate, poor image quality. You couldn't even cap it at 30 if you wanted more consistency, although the frame rate cap was broken there. Like it was just a mess. Now they have massively boosted performance, and it is now faster than the PS5 base with better, not perfect, but maybe better overall image quality. And I think it's pretty good, Tom. Would you say, like, at this point, it's more middling?
Yeah, middling. Promoted from failure, where there was
Yes.
just where just no hope for it. It was just such a massive disappointment, wasn't it, when it came out? And there was no
Really?
alternative mode. And I mean, even the frame rates unlocked in those cutscenes to this day, which I think that's fine. They're mostly in VRR range, but
To
I
be
think
fair, Tom, and on PlayStation 2, with MGS2 and 3, the cutscenes were also left uncapped. So,
yes,
like, it's just kind of
yeah.
like a stylistic choice, I guess, that Kojima went for. I don't know why, but he
We'll just
did.
yeah, we'll go with that. But it is for sure still disappointing, and I think we keep it in the middling category because it's just even right now fully patched, you're getting drops into the mid 30s during
Ugh,
combat. So like what you said in the direct, if you want to keep the frame rate up, you could go stealthy, get the box,
hit the
find
box,
some reeds to crawl
sneak
through,
through.
do whatever
Yes,
you can.
it's your reward for playing well, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, though, is like obviously the thing about the PS5 Pro is that the CPU stuff, it didn't dramatically improve in any way, really. It's the same, essentially, with just some slight
Yo.
adjustments. And you can feel it in games that you're CPU bound, you're not really going to see much change. And that's the big problem now with MGS Delta, is that they've removed the GPU limited areas completely, but now we're CPU bound, which isn't great. But another title that was in the failure zone and has come out to just be sort of okay, I guess, is Silent Hill 2 Remake,
Right.
which, yeah, man, like I played through that on a regular PS5 initially, and then the Pro came out, and boy, oh boy, it was pretty bad at first, right, Tom?
Yeah, that was, I guess the quick recap was launched with PSSR on both modes, and it wrecked the Lumen GI and reflections, caused a ton of flicker. To Believer Team's credit, they swooped right in and delivered a patch 1.06 pretty quickly after launch, and that solved the issue on the performance mode by just turning off PSSR, reverting it back to the regular TAA method. And that's fine. I think a lot of people played at 60. So, but you were just getting back to base PS5 levels of image quality there. Whereas the quality mode still persists with the PSSR upscale, and there is some of that flicker on GI elements, the shaded elements in the initial sort of woodland walk are kind of flickery and shimmery still, which isn't great. And it's curious. Like, there's a few things to say on this. Like, it's very odd that it's been a whole year. There's not been a single update since. We're still on patch 1.06. I tested Silent Hill 2 Remake last night just to see if there's been any change at all, and it's just still the same. And it's also curious to see Bloober in their follow-up game this year, 2025, Chronos: The New Dawn, and made no push for PS5 support, Pro support. And that kind of, I remember going through a string of games around that time this year where there was no pro support either.
Right.
Like there's no support in Elden Ring Night Rain, for example. So it does seem like, yeah, for sure, there's no mandate for Sony to force these pro patches on games as it was, in the case for PS4 Pro. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a
Actually,
strange situation.
Now that you mention it, Tom, I remember when the PS5 Pro came out, I was in the middle of Silent Hill 2, and I first played it right when I got the Pro before the Pro patch arrived. And I
Mm.
remember even in that game's quality mode on base PS5, there were actually performance issues, right? And
Yeah.
the Pro fixed it. And I was like, wow, this is a lot better. Just the nature of PS5 Pro improving it. And then the patch hit and it got worse.
Hmm.
And that was the bummer, right? And this is why I would imagine something like Chronos The New Dawn doesn't even bother with support, right?
Yeah.
Because they figure if they can't get it looking noticeably better, just take advantage of that extra horsepower to smooth out the frame rate.
Yeah.
So
And there's a little while there where you could play the disc version, like just without a PS5 Pro patch. So long
right.
as you had the disc attachment for your Pro, obviously, you could then play it without the patch that wrecked the game for a little while there. But I think Bloober have kind of addressed the performance mode at least.
Alas, there are some failures, games that have not been fixed, and one of them is adjacent to that. It's Silent Hill F, which I have been playing, and man, I had so many positive things to say about the tech prior to release, and it turns out there's a reason for that. One, the PC version's pretty good. That's where I first played it back at Gamescom. But I remember while sitting there playing it, I noticed all the other demo stations with the consoles, they were all regular PS5s, not the Pro. And I was thinking like, I wonder why that is. Did they just have more PS5s? Or I'm sure it was as simple as that. But in reality, it turns out the base PS5 version is a lot better
Mm.
because the implementation of PSSR again, it sucks. It sucks. It has that same problem with all kinds of like weird noise and splotchiness as a result of Lumen GI, and there's no way to fix it. It just
Mhm.
looks bad. Which is why, like, genuinely, this is a game I haven't done it yet, but I've been thinking like, I reach this point where I'm like, should I just pull up my base PS5 for this game? But it's just such a pain in the butt to have to get out a
Right.
separate console just for that. And that's why I say this is a complete failure, because we're at a point where it's like I'm thinking about playing on the lesser machine because the stuff is distracting.
Yeah.
I will say, to be fair, once you get in further into the game, there are plenty of areas where stuff like foliage is like less common, but every time you're out in the town, it's like after that first like nightmare world or whatever, you end up going to the farm area and there's tons of foliage and you're just like, it feels like the real horror is the PSSR artifacts. And but you can't escape.
Yeah.
You know,
That's an interesting game because they did something that I'm not wholly opposed to, which is they consolidated the mode options into one PS5 Pro enhanced mode. And again, here they don't offer any kind of toggles. Maybe they should have offered toggles, considering how poor the PSSR is. But again, in this case, as well as some other games that maybe we can talk about a little bit, like the initial versions of Alan Wake 2 and Jedi Survivor, this is a game that ships with PSSR. Probably shouldn't ship with PSSR. Probably anyone with eyes who looked at it would recognize this game looks best on consoles with TSR, I'd imagine. Should not have shipped in this way, but is this way. But do you blame PSSR? Do you blame the developers? Like, at some point, someone has to look at this and say, this isn't good enough, right?
Yeah, raise a flag at least.
exactly.
Is now the time to talk about Dragon's Dogma 2? Because I think we've had we're unsure of where this one lies, right? Failure, middling. I got
Almost good.
Yeah, I put it in the middling category, but Oliver DM'd me last night just to say I think it's a failure, and I went back and I thought, yeah, actually, it is. This is quite poor.
I remember, man, Oliver, when you first laid eyes on this, you genuinely thought this was just broken.
Yeah.
And it's kind of stuck with me, and I see where you're coming from on this.
So
explain it.
Shall I go into this one? Or
Go for it.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, well, there's only PSSR on this game on Pro, so you've got 3 modes. It's like there's a performance, a balanced, and a quality mode, 720p, 1080p, and 1440p internal res, respectively, all upscaled via PSSR to 4K. Sounds good on paper, but I think we're at a point in this in this game's menus as a side. There are too many options, and you just got those 3 options on top of the ray tracing toggle, a 30 FPS toggle, which, when enabled, has uneven frame pacing. So that's a kind of write off. So you're kind of struggling to find your own personal optimization, and there simply isn't one from my perspective. You've got, no matter which mode you use, there will be flickering on the game's, the RE Engine's GI method. The ray trace GI has a lot of flickering indoors, and even the rasterized one, when you switch off ray tracing, you see it flickering all over the place with any of those modes. So it's made worse if you run it on the performance mode at 720p or the balance mode at 1080p, because there's just fewer pixels to work from, less data per frame, and that shimmer is just more abundant. So you can mitigate it with the 1440p quality mode, but it's still there and it's still a disappointment. I think there is an upside, obviously, which is the performance gains, which are pretty substantial. Like in my original review for it, I was getting like plus 40% performance over the original base PS5, which is just, superb. Like, there's no question that makes it a much smoother way to play, but it's whether the flickering shadows is enough of a deal breaker for you. That kind of defines whether it goes into failure or into the middling category for me.
This was my very first taste, because I was at the PS5 Pro hands-on event back in September of last year.
Right.
This was my very first taste, and I probably should have attached more importance to it at the time. But this was my first taste of like the really dark elements of PSSR. And I can see in my notes from the time I wrote that there's a problem where there's some kind of interaction with the PSSR and RTGI, where the RTGI breaks and has a lot of disocclusion artifacts. And that's indeed, that's what is carried through for the final game. And that's indeed what's in the current version, which I think is just that patch, the initial PS5 Pro patch. I think it's identical. Like, if you're having these big regressions, especially in a game with a lot of ray trace lighting, with PSSR, I really think you're obligated to go back and switch your upscale method to something that's more favorable, whether that's checkerboarding, whether that's TSR, whether that's FSR. Indeed, that's what we've seen from a number of games, which perhaps we can talk about in a minute. But Dragon's Dogma 2 is maybe one of the most compromised, if not the most compromised game that does not currently have some kind of toggle or some kind of ability to go back to a more conventional analytical upscaling method. Maybe Silent Hill F is worse. Silent Hill F is quite awful. I think Silent Hill 2 was pretty bad as well in that performance mode when it launched back last year. But yeah, there are some games that had really, really, really compromised PSSR implementations that were quite unfortunate.
And a lot of them popped up very early on as well. So it was quite a shock for us, waiting to, celebrate PSSR as this magic sauce that fixes everything. Because the specs on paper, right, with PS5 Pro are pretty clear cut. You're going to get a roughly 40% uplift in performance in some games, but the PSSR factor was the part that kind of made it a bit more.
I think, at least to me,
so to have it backfire,
there were always signs that this was not like the DLSS killer. Like, even in that initial showing in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, when I was comparing it to the 4K mode, the 4K quality mode on base PS5. And I was hoping that it would be kind of like of a similar kind, because it's like, you look at DLSS and performance mode, usually it compares favorably to 4K native with TAA in that kind of mode there at full resolution. It was not comparing favorably. It had some noticeable deficits, even at that time, even that kind of short bit of footage. So I never thought the PSSR was like, I mean, at least after my first contact with it, I didn't think PSSR was like God's gift to gamers in its first implementation. But I didn't expect this like really negative feedback loop with RT that has plagued a lot of games these days with RTGI, particularly UE5 titles, which obviously we've discussed.
The thing is, though, as you say all that, but this is one of those weird games where you're essentially given the choice between really bad image quality or actually smooth performance.
Right.
Because the PS5 Pro runs this game a lot better than every other console and seems to run better than even the PC, at least as the PC did. It's like pretty much the only way to get a stable, smooth experience in this game. But you got to give up a lot to get there. So it really is. That's why I say I was kind of mixed on it, because it did make the game a lot smoother and more playable in my eyes. But those same eyes are also like, oh, this is pretty gnarly looking. So it's a tricky one. Thankfully, though, that's really just like the main that we would classify as actually bad in my mind, because of the proximity to when I played them together, like the MGS3 thing combined with Silent Hill F, and knowing some of those other things, like it made me think like, man, the PS5 Pro is not doing that great for me. But it turns out actually that's not really the case. It's just a few outliers that are actually not good. But there's actually quite a few other games out there that are good, but maybe weren't at first. Like you mentioned Alan Wake 2 and Star Wars Jedi Survivor earlier, Oliver, but they're actually quite good now, right?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure how to categorize these games necessarily, because like Alan Wake 2, let's take that as one example. Initially, the game had a PSSR implementation that I thought was unflattering, quite unflattering in some ways, especially in the performance mode, with all the issues we've discussed so far. But it had some favorable elements, like it had RT reflections in the quality mode, right? Which was quite nice. Now, there were limited RT reflections. They weren't as good as the RT reflections that you got on PC, but they were, it was nice to have RT reflections. And then later on, basically, I think we covered this in the DF Direct segment, they added a PSSR toggle, so you could go back to FSR. So if you preferred the FSR resolve, as I think a lot of people did, you could get that resolve. And they also added a 40 FPS balanced mode on PS5 Pro as well, which added the RT from the quality mode to the game on PS5 Pro. And then Star Wars Jedi Survivor, this was kind of an interesting case. Now with Jedi Survivor, the problem was at launch, they had like a really miserable PSSR implementation. Had awful flickering, like this weird strobing, this weird flickering in the foliage. Looked quite terrible. The overall presentation looked kind of broken. It looked very soft, indistinct, had a lot of flickering artifacts, not a pleasant implementation. And then with the patch 10, they said they upgraded the PSSR to a new version, and that largely fixed the foliage pulsing, largely fixed a lot of the other issues the game had. Relative to FSR, where would it rank? I'm not quite sure necessarily, but at least it didn't look too bad. And then they also added some additional RT to the performance mode, and it looked pretty good there. Another game that was on my list is potentially even quite problematic with PSSR up until very, very recently, up until a few days ago, was The Outer Worlds 2. The Outer Worlds 2 just arrived. Obviously, I bemoaned the state of PSSR in my recent video on it, but lo and behold, they've just released a patch. There's some footage of that running on screen right now. They've reverted to TSR in PS5 Pro. So they've gone back from PSSR to TSR, no toggle whatsoever. They've just gone back to it. I think it's well worth it because it does not shimmer nearly as much. It actually is a sharper resolve, a more stable resolve. Doesn't have a lot of that nasty RTGI noise that the base console, or rather the PlayStation 5 Pro had before. It also seems to run a lot better. Now, I wasn't able to do a deep analysis across multiple systems here. Perhaps it's just a function of the new patch rather than switching PSSR, because I don't think that PSSR was driving the performance drops before. But in the Outer Worlds now, it does basically run at a lock 60 FPS, a lock 30 FPS in PS5 Pro. And there are also like a number of games, I'd probably put them in like the middling-ish category, where like, maybe they have a FSR toggle, PSSR toggle, like Avatar and Star Wars Outlaws would fall in this category, right? And maybe the improvement is like not so great with PSSR. Maybe there's a bit of an improvement with FSR, but it's not that much. Again, you're really relying on that like roughly 30% boost in terms of actually rendering performance in the PS5 Pro in order to secure a better experience there. There are some other titles, like obviously we've discussed Helldivers. There's a pretty mild resolution improvement there. Likewise with Clair Obscur Expedition 33. That's another game I looked at. Very similar in PS5 and PS5 Pro, more resolution. Doom the Dark Ages, again, more resolution on PS5 Pro. Not that I'm begging for PSSR or whatever, but maybe obviously they have some additional ray tracing in the mix there on PC. Maybe would have been nice to see that on PS5 Pro, but unfortunately at the moment that's all you're really getting is an improvement to resolution in it, and not a gigantic one either. Mafia: The Old Country looks quite similar between PS5 and PS5 Pro. You get some additional lumen reflections in the performance mode on PS5 Pro, which is nice, but again, not a huge difference. And then there's Astrobot, which gets PSSR, and like a lot of other PSSR titles, it's kind of a middling result. That's not necessarily better or worse. So I think there are a lot of games, like looking at my own personal list here of games that I've looked at, it's about half successful, half middling, and then a few games that are like really problematic and are just worse in my opinion. So anyways, we can discuss our kind of overall conclusions in a moment, but Yeah, that's just rounding out my list of games that I've covered.
Is there anything else for you, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, there's one which is in the, well, I had it in the middling category, but it might just bump up to good overall, which is Black Ops 6. We covered it last year or earlier in 2025.
Yeah.
Pretty much a very considered effort that tries to do everything it can with pro hardware. I think the one thing that stuck out as a criticism was the PSSR side effects, the flickering white speckled artifacts on specular surfaces around the hideout area, for example, any shaded spots around there. I was surprised to find, even a year on, that's still there. I've tested it last night, still there, still an issue. But I don't think I can really hold that against all the positives that it brings to the table. So you've got an anti-lag VRR mode at 60 hertz, which they added. Very smart use of the technology. You've got much better performance at 120 hertz, where it uses the regular, IWTAA. And there's a bunch of visual upgrades on Pro, like better screen space GI, screen space reflections, shadows. So there's a suite of stuff that they've done with the Pro hardware there, on top of the improved performance. So yeah, if you can stand the PSSR artifacts on some elements of the image, that's a kind of a win overall, I think. But some people might not love that.